Severance Season 2, Episode 10, the finale named Cold Harbor, is easily one of the best episodes of TV I think I've ever watched. Between Mr. Milkshake hitting it and Helly pulling off a Hailey Bieber at the end of the season, I can't even put to words how good this episode truly was. There's just so many ideas and concepts and cultures that all came together in one episode, and it's just insane. For a while now, since I've been making these videos, I've been in my brain thinking about how the person who created this show, like truly created this show down to every detail. Even when I make my screenshots that I use in these videos, I have to look at these screenshots and I'm like, this show is shot so beautifully. Something like this can only truly be made by a genius, by a lot of collaborative work as well, I think, in my opinion. The amount of literary references and things that just work and things that are just right, the way characters react to moments that are just right, I can't even say enough. Coming into this episode, I already knew that the twist ending we were going to get, or the reveal we were going to get about even the things we think we had figured out, like what MDR was doing, what they were refining, what Cold Harbor was. I knew that there would be no amount of us breaking things down that would make us hit it on the nose. And I was not disappointed. I knew from the way that the show was written that we weren't going to be able to actually predict what would happen in this episode. But I was blown away by the fact that you couldn't even get your mind around what was supposed to happen next in every scene of this episode. Like, there was no predicting any part of this, and anyone who says that they could is an absolute liar. There's only so much you really could have figured out before seeing basically this episode. And there's even more. Even with everything that they've told us about what it is to refine, what they were refining in these files, there's so much more to it. And there's so many more questions that we have. But if you're into full in-depth breakdowns of Severance, if you want to know all the details everyone probably missed or are not talking enough about, this is the channel for you. So hit that subscribe button, like this video, comment down below what you thought of this episode, and let's get right into it. Now, the order of this video will go in order of most importance, not order of what we saw in the actual episode, because I think this way we'll get through most of the good stuff and it'll all make sense. Starting with the big reveal of what the numbers actually are. Now, you have to read between the lines as well as listen to what Mrs. Cobel is saying to understand what information we did get finally in this finale, but we still do not know everything that there is to know about the refining process, but mainly some of the most important parts. Starting with number 1, Mrs. Cobel says that the 4 tempers, frolic, dread, malice, and woe, are the building blocks of Gemma's mind. Now, Mark follows this up by saying, what am I building? But the actual question here is, what is he destroying or taking away? That is why Mrs. Cobel doesn't answer him directly when he asks that, because he's not building a person, he's erasing one. He's destroying and taking the tempers out of Gemma, creating new blank consciousnesses, creating a new any with every file. We then find out that the reason Cold Harbor would even kill Gemma is not because Cold Harbor itself would kill Gemma, but because they simply would not need her after Cold Harbor, and neither would they need Mark S. That is a very important detail, which leads me also to the question, again, something I've been bringing up through the entirety of this show. We still do not know if the real Gemma even ever died. Was she even in that car accident? Is that truly what happened? Or was she just simply kidnapped and brought down to the testing floor? Now, as well as on this channel, we've already talked about how all of the files we've seen so far in the show, even though the names of them have all been places, it's actually at this point not relevant to what's actually going on with any of these files. And that the files were literally them coding her tempers out of her own memories. This is something I talked about in previous videos. But we need to talk about it again and in more depth now that we have these answers that we have. Now, each one of these files is actually a memory or a recreation of a core memory of Gemma's. That is something that's been misconstrued based on this episode that I'm seeing a lot of people talk about. Yes, a lot of people would have trauma from going to the dentist. Yes, a lot of people would have trauma from turbulence, but that is not to take away from the importance of all 25 of these files to Gemma. Every room is a recreation of a core memory of Gemma's or something particular to herself. And all of these combined are the things that ultimately made her who she was. You have to go back a couple episodes where we saw the whole origin story of Mark and Gemma, and you wonder why they're bringing up all of these things that he talked about early on, all the way in season 1, about all the things that made Gemma who she was and all the specific things that sounded just like the wellness sessions Gemma was doing with other innies, similar to those wellness sessions being about the core pieces of a person and telling the innies about their outies and who they are. That's what these rooms are. They're all the core memories and core things about Gemma that made her ultimately who she was. Now, this then tells you what the goal actually is. The goal has always been to create a severed individual who cannot be triggered by any of the pressure points. Think about the candle we saw in season 1 from Mrs. Cobel, the pressure points where Gabi was talking about and was looking for in Mark's basement. These trigger points are central to what is happening in each one of these rooms. Each one of these rooms is a trigger point. The Christmas memory with Mark, that's where the candle comes from. All of these other rooms down there, the ones we haven't seen and the ones we have seen, are all core to things that should remind Gemma of who she was. The goal is that she doesn't remember who she is. The efficacy test is asking her after she's seen the crib, who are you? And then he says the barrier is holding, she feels nothing. Because the ultimate memory, the ultimate pressure point that should make Gemma remember who she is, the strongest one, would be seeing the crib and having to take it apart. Just like her own real memory of seeing that crib and watching Mark take it apart. She doesn't remember who she is because they have essentially refined every single temper out of her own memories, so that when her innie's consciousness comes across these memories, it truly still does not know who they are. This goes back to everything else we've seen in the show. I still am a huge believer that love does transcend severance. I still believe there have been clear signs and scenes throughout the show that should show us something is off. For example, when Mark and Gemma see each other in the hallway when they're going into the break room. There's a reason that's the first memory Mark has when he does the reintegration process. On the other side of that, there's a reason they look at each other like that, and it looks like they're both about to turn around and look back. That's for a reason. There's the scene where he's in the hallways with Helly and she walks out and she says, "I forgive you." There was something very different about the way she said it and the way that was shot that to me had an underline of this is Gemma herself really saying, "I forgive you." Like it's like a mental thing. Like they don't know where it's coming from, but they know that there's something there. The same way Petey says, you still feel all of these things down there. You just don't know what they are. We've been being told the entire show that feelings and emotions transcend severance, especially love, but it's not in the classic form you think where it's like, oh, Mark all of a sudden just remembers who his wife is just from seeing her. It's the small subtle things. It's the subtle looks, the subtle that's what we were supposed to be paying attention to. I want to point out some very specific details about this scene. Did anyone else see the Cobel hand signals when she was standing there and she's standing there behind Devin? That particular hand signal is actually very relevant to what's happening in this scene. We see Cobel is trying to act like she's on their side, trying to get Mark to help his outie, but in reality, I think this is going to be a huge twist later down the line, that Mrs. Cobel is, yes, trying to turn against Lumon, but not necessarily end the severance procedure or the severance chip. I think she wants the power. Now, when it comes to this hand signal, I'm familiar with the controversy and outright basically and outright basically acceptance that this hand signal is not real. But in a show about conspiracy theories and companies who are running the world or secretly trying to run the world, that aligns perfectly with the conspiracy theory of this upside down hand signal. That is not a coincidence. Now, in pop culture and conspiracy, this hand signal is actually a gesture for power, not the origination of this hand gesture. Pointing that out before you guys try to come for me in the comments, but the conspiracy of this hand gesture, secretly signs of power and control or allegiance to hidden groups. Like, for example, in real life, Freemasonry and the Illuminati is where the conspiracy comes from. But in this show could mean any hidden group, and in my opinion, actually means Mrs. Cobel is out here for herself. To me, their interaction and Mark's Innie's interaction with Mrs. Cobel tells us a lot more about this hidden feeling of Mrs. Cobel being on their side for now, but really having an ulterior motive behind pushing them to bring down Lumon. And a lot of that is central to her being the founder of the Severance chip. So keep that in mind. Now, the next thing I need to point out about these particular scenes is Irving's drawing comment and Cobel saying, "What's about Irving having these drawings?" A reminder that Irving's Innie saw these drawings during the OTC. That is what caused him to draw the version on the card. So this is not a bleed from the Severance chips more than it is them confirming from Irving's Audi that this hallway truly does exist. Now let's talk about Mark versus Mark. This beautiful poetically shot scene that just gave me so many kind of like hints towards almost like an Inception Matrix kind of shot. The way it was shot was beautiful. The way that these chairs sit in this, again, concept of duality that we've been talking about since the beginning of this season. Now, I want you guys to peep how the real Mark is in the cold and the blue outside, and the Innie Mark is in the warmth, fiery, lively, and you can maybe say in some cases more red inside, where Mark is trying to pitch and scheme to his own Innie using the same form of media to convince him to basically get rid of himself and to sacrifice his own life in order to save Gemma. This inherent hierarchy he has over his Innie. Mark as his Audi, assuming that his life is more important than his Innie, treating him like the kid that he later on says that he is, and not knowing the Innie's real names, the real name of his love, which he calls Helene instead of Helly, comparing his life as bigger and more important just because he has more experiences and was given and had the privilege of being able to have these experiences. That is what is at the center of why Mark's Innie turns against him, because he feels all of this entitlement, this hierarchy, and this misunderstanding, and not true acknowledgement of what Mark S. the Innie is truly going through, and that his life actually does matter. He catches all of these through the way Mark says certain things, and that's what causes them to go head to head. Now, I want to point out that this is exactly what we saw happening on the Chikai Bardot cards. It was a man fighting a man, but Gemma explains to us that it was truly a man who's fighting himself and overcoming himself, creating an ego death. And that's probably what we're going to have to explore later on in maybe season 3 of the potential ego death of Mark the Audi versus Mark the Innie, and coming to the conclusion that both of their lives truly matter the way that they are. Now, jumping backwards, let's talk about Helly and her interaction with James Eagan. We find out through this interaction that the relationship between Helena and her dad is even more strained than we even thought. The fetid moppet that he does not see KIER inside of, the dirty child that does not have the qualities of KIER. Because of this, he has been siring children outside of her. And the question is, with who and where? And some of these women were coming to the birthing retreat, which now makes it make sense. That's what they meant last episode when they said she is one of James. That is what they meant, that all of these other children he's been siring are coming to the birthing retreat to be born. All of these other children as well failed to accomplish what James was looking for, but now he sees it in Helly. But my question is, why does he see KIER in Helly, the most rebellious person in the entire show, when they painted KIER to be such an upright, righteous, and very corporate political leader? Now, this could be because that same righteous part of KIER is what he's seeing in Helly. The Helly who's challenging all of them and doing what's right and rebelling against all of these rules. I don't know let me know what you guys think, but it's super interesting that our most rebellious and opposite character of everything we're seeing at Lumon is the one he sees KIER inside of. Now, the question also becomes, who else is a child of James Eagan? Now, this brings me back to what I was saying earlier about Devin. Devin has been off. A lot of channels have been talking to you guys about all the details that make Devin seem off, including her blue eyes, the way she dresses, she wears blue, and the fact that she's even married to Rick. On this channel, we've covered why Rickon is also off, and that I believe that he is or still is potentially a goat. Now, I believe one of these two people is an Eagan. The question is which one? So all of these other women as well, he sired children with Devin's mother and Mark's mother, right? Because look at Devin and Mark. Yes, this whole season, this whole show, we've been told that they're related, but do they really look related to you? Devin has crystal blue eyes and the same off reddish hair that Helly does. That's not a coincidence. I've pointed out how Rickon also has blue eyes, so that's an interesting detail. I'm not going to venture as far as say as they're both children of Eagan. That would be very freaking weird since they have a kid together. One of them is definitely a child of James Eagan, and the question is which, because Rickon has all of this ideology and the things he does and says that are very similar to the Eagan ideology, and Devin looks like a child of James Eagan. So that could be the source of what we've all been saying about how they don't look like they're supposed to be together. That could be the reason why. It could be an arranged marriage between one person they want to be with, a person who is an Eagan. Now, we've talked about the importance of things like blue eyes, color theory throughout the show, and the colors people are wearing constantly. So I want to talk about one of the best theories I've seen on what is actually happening with the colors in the show. On my channel, we've discussed how the red and blue, like the red pill and the blue pill from the Matrix, and how the actual original Severance chip. And on my channel, we talked about how the original prototype of the Severance chip was blue and green. Therefore, it was the blue and green pill, like we've seen it drawn as a pill. And therefore, that was why everything was blue and green on Lumon's side versus anyone who was against Lumon was being depicted in red, or anyone who was being enlightened or alive was depicted in red. Now, there's an even deeper theory that actually transcends all of television and has held true through multiple different movies like The Matrix, which is a huge reference for this show, and many, many others. And that is the red, green, and blue theory, which is red as blood and life, green as undead or death, and blue as coldness, sterility, and supernatural. Now, you can see just off of this that this is probably what's really going on in the show, because red is commonly associated with blood, which is a universal symbol of life and energy. And in many cultures, red represents passion, strength, and being alive. Now, green is representing dead or undead because it's often associated with decay and toxicity and the supernatural in its own way. In the context of the undead, it can represent sickness and unnatural life. And blue is often represented in coldness, sterility, and a different form of supernatural in contrast to this red and green. Now, the coldness and the detachment is associated with cold temperatures. What have we been seeing throughout the show? Emotional detachment, medical or scientific horror, and environments that might represent labs and operating rooms. And in the supernatural sense, blue is often tied to ghosts and otherworldly forces, and in being in a state of otherworldliness, like a spirit, for example. Different from the green, which is more of like a physically undead person, like a zombie. All of these things are connected. So using this theory, when the show comes back, is going to tell you a lot about what's going on in the next season. Now, in the rest of this part of the episode, where Helly and Mark are on the severed floor and Mark goes to continue to finish the Cold Harbor file, I want to talk about Helly and Mark's relationship and dynamic because a lot of people are misinterpreting what it actually is. Now, I've seen a lot of people say that it's just physical and that none of this makes sense, whatever, but truly you gotta have to actually understand the perspective from both of these characters. Helly and Mark is like a childhood first love. This is not lust. This is not a simple relationship only built on physical relations. These are two childlike characters mentally who have found their first crush, the first love. Think about all of us, and we all remember the strength and how much our first crush or our first love had us in a chokehold, even if it was childish. Think about the things you did as a child if you even liked someone, right? That's what we're seeing play out in Helly and Mark on the severed floor. What they have is like a first love, and it's just as beautiful as the true and adult love Mark and Gemma have, right? They're just two different kinds. And all of this is what you need to understand why Mark S would choose Helly, why this dynamic is important, and the underlying story that is trying to be told of innies versus outies and whose life is more important or whose life is real. We see Helly talk about Delaware, which from season 1, you would remember was the only place she could name when she was brought onto the severed floor originally, right? And we talked about the relevance of Delaware back then. So if you want to know what that is, go watch one of my very first videos. But she then brings up the Equator, and later on we see it play out when they're trying to escape Milchek, and she says, "See you at the Equator." This all comes back around at the end of the episode, which we will get to. Now, before I wrap this up and I connect all of the dots from everything we have just talked about, breaking down majority of this episode, I want to talk about some of the other details that I feel the need to mention, but do not necessarily connect to the bigger point of this video. Starting with number 1, the new painting, The Exalted Victory of Cold Harbor. We get to see all these cool shots of everyone literally being in this new painting that is depicting the 9 CEOs, including Helly, and every character we've seen throughout the show. Almost as if Lumon's been watching everything, right? But it's an interesting detail to see all of these characters included in this victory. But I want to point out that there is a moment where it zooms in on Milchek, similar to other characters, but he is the only character it double zooms in on, and it zooms in on his eyes. We see that in this painting, his eyes are brown, different from the original paintings he received from Lumon, where his eyes are blue. This is very clearly building upon the detail that I've brought it up multiple times at this point, where a lot of people who are very clearly directly connected to Lumon, whether that is through lineage, through the ether, or through being an Eagan, all have blue eyes. Now, this is very clearly them saying he's no longer one of us. That then fast forwards to when we see the KIER Eagan statue. KIER's statue stance at one point is very eerie. Now, while he's talking about this grand agenda that Mark has helped him with, he hits this sign, which is the literal sign of Baphomet, which represents as above, so below. Now, this could go a couple different ways, so I'll let you guys in the comments talk about what you think that means as far as KIER Eagan literally representing Satan himself, something we've talked about in previous breakdowns about how KIER, the name, literally means dark one, and how Lumon, just like illumination, means bringer of knowledge, which is what Satan was before his fall as an angel. Now you have this. I think it pretty much confirms at this point, plus the goats, that there's some Satanery going on in Lumon and at the Lumon facility. Now let's talk about Milchek, because the conversation between Milchek and this KIER animatronic that is being voiced by Ben Stiller, but obviously someone else who works at Lumon, is very interesting because we watch as the KIER statue goes ahead and makes fun of Milchek for the things that Lumon knows about him based off of the review he received, right? And we see that moment in Milchek's face of, wow, this company that I work for that truly does not like me or care about me, but I'm doing everything for. And then that plays into the relevance of an HBCU, particularly marching band, and a black man at Lumon being the ones who celebrate the finishing of the Cold Harbor file. Now, we also have to point out that Cold Harbor itself was the file that a lot of people attributed to a Civil War site. But what was the Civil War fought over? It was fought over slavery. And when was Lumon founded? In 1865, basically insinuating that Lumon was the answer to us no longer having the ability to legally enslave other people. All of this is connected. We've talked about in previous videos how Milchick's inner dilemma would be about being a Black man in what we think is America, working at a corporation that is literally making new types of slaves. That is the goal of Lumon, which we'll talk about more later on in this video. And his inner dilemma of being the Black man who works here and is in control of the severed floor. And that is why, out of anyone else who works there, he has previously been treating them more like human beings and allowing them certain things, and was the face of reform for the Severance floor. All of that is important and connected. And if you feel some way about me talking about those things, that's on you. That's just what this literary reference is for. Now, the last thing I want to point out, because it's just funny to me, is that when Milchick breaks out of the bathroom and he jumps on top of this vending machine, I don't know why, but this just made me really think of the Predator from Alien versus Predator. It was just given that. And it was really awesome. And I think it was one of the many references that are easy to miss in Severance that is referring to a bunch of different shows, a bunch of different movies, and that feeling we get from those movies and how it's related to what we're seeing happen in Severance, but in a funny way, which brings me directly into the awesome climax escape scene from Mark and Mark S between the severed floor and the testing floor, and how a lot of these scenes, like the fight between him and Drummond, the fight between Brienne of Tarth and Drummond, and all of this is connected to that same idea where we're watching where in some movies all of a sudden the main character would turn into a superhero and know how to fight, and they didn't do that in Severance, only further making the show that good. And the humor in a lot of these scenes mixed in with the action and the anxiousness that they build up for us for these scenes, it was just incredible. One of the funniest and most humor moments is the elevator scene where Mark S. the innie goes down the elevator with Drummond. He's telling him all the things he's going to do for Mark when he gets down to the testing floor. And in that transition where they switch minds, Mark loses control of his physical body, which is something we've seen happen multiple times and has been alluded to throughout that transition of the elevators. And in this particular scene, it leads him to accidentally shooting and killing Drummond, only adding to this idea of tropes and ideas of action movies we've seen in the past where a character has to cross that line. But this is easily one of the most clever and funniest ways they could have put that in Severance. And then to go on to see this person who is Mark S. the Audi walking down the hallways to free his wife like he's literally some John Wick character, but knowing that this ain't John Wick for real. This is Mark the Audi who like accidentally shot somebody and was freaking out when the blood got on him, and now he's down there just trying to figure out where he's going. So that duality of a scene you're watching having such a different reaction and having such a different origin, beautiful chef's kiss. Now, slightly shift, I want to keep talking about Brienne of Tarth because as soon as she got casted, I knew there would be some action with her character. I knew she was going to have to do something physical. And I also want to talk about the goats through this scene, right? Because the most important part about this is the goats ended up being sacrifices like a lot of people predicted. I do not believe that that means that all the other theories about the goats are not true, however, because there's just too much to the Rickon being a goat theory for that to be the only thing the goats are being used for. But it is definitely one of the things that the goats is being used for. Now, when she says, "How many more must I give?" that to me really solidified a lot of other theories we've talked about. Number one being that the goat and her asking how many more kind of proves that there has been other people outside of Gemma on the testing floor before Gemma. Now, with there being other people on the testing floor, this brings us to the Irving Theory. Now, we got to wrap all this around, so stick with me when I bring up all these details from all these other episodes that kind of bring us back to this point. Starting with number 1, we know that this is the year of vision according to the statue that is given to Mrs. Wong. If you go back to the episode with Mrs. Cobel, I talked about how her first year in school was the year of vision and she graduated in the year of wiles, meaning that most likely all of the principles in order, which does start with vision and end with wiles, is counting down cycles of 9, and therefore she graduated in the 9th year at the age of 21, where she entered at 12. Now, this same logic can be used for what we're seeing now happen in this episode, because in the order, it now makes sense that Irving has been at Lumon for 9 years, but entered the severed floor 3 years ago, which means he spent 6 years as a Lumon employee who was not severed and then was severed 3 years prior to what's going on now in the show with Mark and Gemma. Then adding in that Mark had his freshman fluke when he was refining Gemma, and Mark has been at Lumon for 2 years, but they were married for 4 prior, which gives us 6. So try to keep along with these numbers. It's a little convoluted because they don't necessarily line up, but it kind of does. That means Irving was at Lumon for a certain amount of time before the next experiment, which is Gemma. Mark being at Lumon for 2 years is because they figured out through his freshman fluke that he could refine Gemma better than anyone else. But what was the experiment before Gemma? The year Irving was severed. That might be why he knows about the testing floor, because Irving was the original target of something similar, where they put someone maybe he knew or he loved down on the severed floor, but pointing out the fact that he says in the last episode he's never felt this type of love, but has he never felt it, or does he not remember? There's a lot of ways this could go, but he was there on the refining floor refining someone else who was not Gemma. Now let's talk about Mark and Gemma and their reconnection. Now, I still believe love does transcend severance. We talked about earlier in this video how Cold Harbor ended up being the crib, which ended up being the reason why Gemma's IVF was central to her storyline, and it all connects and makes sense, and that the final memory was not her death, and that Gemma may have never even died. Now we're seeing that Mark makes it down to the testing floor, and his reaction to seeing Gemma in the Cold Harbor room is probably layered, because remember, this is the Mark who knows what the crib is. Now he's in this room and he's telling Gemma, "I'm your husband, you need to leave with me." And that is when the doctor is telling her, "No, you don't, this man is dangerous. He's down here to try to hurt you. Do not let him touch you." Now, I want to rewind all the way to episode 1, where we were told that handshakes were optional and must be requested. And throughout multiple different scenes, it's been very clear that physical touch and physical contact was something that must be requested, and was actually something they didn't really want any of them doing and wanted them to avoid during season 1. It brings me down to this moment in this episode that I think a lot of people missed, because a lot of people are saying that Gemma's in this room not remembering who Mark is automatically proves that the chip works, and proves that this experiment, this final test, the efficacy test, worked. However, I don't agree. I think that Gemma slowly letting down her guard, him coming closer, her having these feelings but not knowing what they are, is very synonymous with everything we've seen happen in the episode, but does not mean that Mark walking in front of Gemma had no effect. And that's why they hyper focus on do not let him touch you. And then when they do hold hands, that is why the doctor and Jane Eagan freak out. Love not only transcends severance, trigger points and pressure points, like really important memories and parts of a person's identity, not only transcend severance, but so does physical touch. Keep all of this in mind. But In my opinion, that is what leads her to trust him and walk out the door with him, is because she knows that there's something he's saying that is true, not because it's just a stranger who she's listening to because she's oppressed. All of this connects to the rest of what happens in this episode, because Mark gets his wife out of there. We get the funny elevator back up scene where Mark S and Miss Casey are kissing, and they're like, what is going on here? And then Mark S's innie gets Miss Casey to the exit stairwell and throws her out of there as Gemma, but doesn't leave. Because even though he even takes a moment to hesitate, be like, oh yeah, I should walk out, he still can't leave because he can't wrap his mind around that he may never be alive again. So he's sitting there hesitating. He doesn't know what to do. Should I go? Should I stay? What am I going to do? And that is when Helly hits the corner. And he turns around, and in the most poetic moment of them all, they have met at the Equator. This red lined hallway that is the line between two worlds. Now you can look at it as the severed floor is the line between two worlds, because it's technically the floor between the actual Lumon and the real world and the testing floor, right? But you could also look at it as the exit stairway hallway is the line between two worlds, the outside world where Gemma is and the world in here where Helly is, right? But they end up either way meeting at the Equator, the line between two half worlds in red. And this is when Mark S, the innie, chooses Helly. Now, none of this was planned. None of this was planned. Lumon didn't know that this was going to happen. But this literally flips everything we've seen on its head. Because even though the efficacy test failed, Gemma's experiment ended up failing because of what Mark did. But also Mark entering the room, in my opinion, may or may not have proved that it still didn't work. Escaping Gemma ruined the real experiment, effectively killing all 25 of the other consciousnesses in a way. But flipping it all on its head, Mark's innie's actions at the end of the show have now created a new path to the same outcome. He proves that the Severance chip separates two consciousnesses perfectly because he chose Helly and not Gemma. And he will become the experiment. But let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you guys think about everything we saw in this particular episode. I've had a lot of fun breaking down this show. This show is easily top 3 shows of all time, in my opinion. I'm not ready to say top 1 because you never know. if you're an OG Game of Thrones watcher, you know what I'm talking about. But it's definitely up there. So let me know what you guys think about this episode. Anything you guys feel like I may have missed, anything you guys want to point out or just talk about, all your theories, because I really appreciate reading all of them. And a lot of the theories that I have are only because you guys help me along the way and you guys tell me what you guys think and the things that you also catch, and it all starts to connect. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.